Good morning, everybody. Welcome back. For students, sections are meeting this week, of course. The ones yesterday, I'm told, went very well. So it's rumored that Americans are polarized. Divided. How badly are we polarized? Everyone wants to measure that now. Half of political science departments are getting grants to study it. There's been a lot of language in our public discourse the last, actually several years, about whether America is on the brink of some kind of new conflict or self-destruction or civil war. That term civil war gets bandied about very easily, usually because people aren't thinking about the real one we had in the 19th century. But let's start with the place of universities in this. Here we are in the peaceable kingdom. And sometimes it is, isn't it? Of a university. You might have a favorite place in Sterling Library to go hide for quietude. Maybe it's in your college. All the rest of us find it where we can. We like to live near universities. People retire near universities. Whole huge retirement complexes are built now near universities because universities do cool things. They have lectures and seminars and workshops, and you can get workshopped within a hair of your life at universities. Colleges and universities are among the slowest changing institutions in American life. That's a quote from Andy Delbanco in his wonderful little book called College. Andy's a scholar of American studies and literature and history and now of universities and so on and so forth at Columbia. He wrote this little book called College, which is very much worth reading. That's the title. He does a kind of a modern history of this thing called a college and what's happening to it. How's its business model doing? How has it been reshaped? Just revolutionized since, start wherever you want, certainly since the 1960s. Since pluralism became something at the center of American life instead of always on the edges, and then when multiculturalism became the thing in the 1990s, it reshaped it again. It's been reshaped by race, reshaped by gender, reshaped to a degree by class, in one way in earlier times, in another way now. We want to believe these institutions are meritocracy. Some good books on that too. Delbanco, I'm continuing. They are, quote, slower even than the post office. Now, our study of Yale, Yale and slavery, which you're reading this week, next week, week after, may only reinforce that perception. Because you're going to see a long story. We only go to the early 19th century, but it's a long story of slow and rocky change, lots of change, but maybe not always in the moral direction you might have wished if what you want is a pleasing and progressive and glorious story of your Yale. We have seen recently with so many universities and small colleges looking so seriously at their past with slavery and race and all kinds of other issues. Perhaps we've reached a new kind of fruitful crossroad in the history of these amazing institutions we call universities. We may not exactly know yet. What are the long-term effects going to be of this kind of internal, institutional self-reflection? Is it going to mean a lot of new monuments on campuses? Is it going to mean new curriculum? Apparently. Is it going to mean new understandings? Is it going to help Americans get over some of their innocence? Maybe. Even more so, we're experiencing a reckoning with the very idea, I think, of the changing mission and purpose of these colleges and universities, as well as primary and secondary schools, curriculums, the freedom to read and learn without religiously or politically driven censorship. We never had an era quite like this of book banning. Well, like since long ago. The free university, inside and outside its gates, its pursuit of diversity, its attempted meritocracy, its curriculums, and its business models are undergoing scrutiny and pressure in new ways the Puritan founders of this place could not even conceive of. Their plan was very tidy, and narrow. Train young men to be congregational ministers, and they bloody did. By the middle of the 18th century, roughly 50% of all ministers all over New England were trained in theology here. And eventually more ministers were trained in theology at Yale than any other place in the United States, until probably somewhere in the 20th century. This American college or university is a profoundly important American reinvention. You probably don't need to hear this, but once in a while, a little reminder. We take so much for granted in these magnificent places with all their resources. You're in a world-class art museum here, in case you didn't know it. I'm sure many of you know it. This is a destination museum. People come here from all over. Every time I walk in here, I wish I was going into the art. But these universities are an American reinvention of an ancient idea, remade in medieval times, in Italy, in Germany, and then in Britain, and then recreated again in colonial America. The first three, of course, were Harvard, and William and Mary, and Yale. The modern American public school and university, public school and university, may indeed be. We could have an argument about this. Try it on. It may be the most democratic institution that the United States ever created, even as it has always been a laboratory of both social mobility and economic and racial inequality. The public school, created very early in the Republic, in the antebellum era, actually first, really in the late 18th century, early antebellum era here and there, mostly first in Massachusetts, other places, and then the great public universities by the 19th and then into the 20th century. Can you think of a more fully democratic institution in the sense that it reshaped the lives of millions of people? We'll see this later. Out of the Civil War came, among the other major economic pieces of legislation out of the Lincoln administration during the war, and because of the war came the Morrill Act that created land-grant colleges. Land was granted for colleges in New York State and Michigan and Wisconsin and Ohio. I went to the first land-grant college. Of course, 6 others claim they're the first 2. Michigan State, then known as Michigan Agricultural College. And there used to be a smokestack, huge smokestack by the football stadium that said MAC on it. They finally took that off because it was one of the favorite chants of the University of Michigan people. Land-grant colleges were to educate farmers, store clerks who barely got through high school from towns, the sons and daughters of the masses of Americans moving west. Among Americans' most treasured values, I think still is that a higher education can remake your life. What if we ever gave that up? How many, no shows of hands, that's not necessary. How many in this room had your life reshaped by a college or a university? Or maybe you might even think, in spite of it, you had your life reshaped. I don't know. You know, there's always a tension, there's always pushback. I had to take this, and I didn't want to take that, but I got to take that. As endangered as such a great ideal may be, and if you haven't been paying attention, colleges and universities have been under scrutiny in recent years. College presidents have been shown the exit door because of something they said or didn't say last year. As endangered as this great ideal may seem to be, who involved in education? Your side, my side, all our sides, or aspiring to it, does not want to believe in this gospel, that college will remake your life. What's crept into our politics now is interesting. We have people running for the highest office saying, you don't need a college degree for that job. You don't need a college degree for... It used to be the opposite, wasn't it? Here's how you get a student loan. Here's how you can, find mobility through education. It certainly was true in my life. Nobody believes this today, but when I was a freshman at Michigan State, in the fall semester term, we were on terms, it cost $250 a term. I'm sorry. Don't tell your parents that. And that was a serious check for my dad. Had to do it 3 times a year. I mean, damn. It's gone up a lot. State universities are now private institutions, practically. 75 to 80% of all funding in most flagship major state universities, like the Big Ten schools, like the great Southern schools, the Western schools, private funds. Now, okay. One of the reasons we did this study of Yale is because of that ideal. And I still remember Peter Salovey, the first time we talked about all this, he said, look, let's do what a university can do. Let's do what we do best. And I completely agreed with him. And we had that whole conversation. What do universities do? Well, they create knowledge and they teach. Well, but they don't always do that about themselves. Over in Sterling and Beinecke libraries, there are 3 or 4 dozen histories of Yale. In fact, I never really counted them all. In Peter Salovey's office, the president's office, they have a huge book cabinet, and most of them, copies are in there too. And Peter actually showed me that he'd read a few. I think we found the word slavery used or addressed or mentioned in about 3 of them. No. That's not that terribly surprising when you read this history. But let me just say a few things here about the scope and scale of this book you're reading about Yale, and then move into this question of, well, are we polarized? How polarized are we? What is the it that might happen here, or could happen here, or can't happen here, whether it's this election year or beyond? First of all, universities obviously are communities of many generations, depending on how you count a generation. And I think a university generation is actually, I think, shorter than the typical 20-year measure of a family generation. Child, parent, grandparent. You can leave here and come back in 10 years and there's a lot you don't recognize. The people, for one thing. You don't know anybody. Or, why'd they change all that? Or when did they build this? So maybe college generations are a bit shorter, possibly. However you want to count these, there have been somewhere in the neighborhood of 18 to 20 generations of Yale's. This is undergraduates. I'm thinking about all the professional schools and graduate school. There has been an 18th century Yale. Its conception's actually born of the 17th century, as we'll see next week. Certainly there's been a 19th century Yale, and there's a 20th century Yale, and now there's a 21st century Yale. How are they different? They're very different. Yale was born in a foreign world, a pre-modern time, the early 18th century. All those ministers who founded this place, of course, came of age in the 17th century. This place was founded in a time where the very concept of individual liberty, of human rights, were at best ill-formed or non-existent. At least in most public ways. There were no debates about human rights here in 1705 or 10. Now there was a book published, the first anti-slavery text or treatise published in the Americas was published in 1700 by a Harvard minister, judge. He's actually a court judge. And the 10 ministers who met out in Saybrook to found this original college and then created it over here had all read this text. It's by a man named Samuel Sewall. It's called The Selling of Joseph. It's short, but it's essentially a moral take on the problem of slaveholding. And it's a condemnation. It doesn't take up the meaning of race and all that just yet. But there was that text. At the time Yale was founded, there were virtually no written constitutions in the world. There will be by the end of that 18th century, a few dozen of them. Everyone was trying a constitution by the 1770s, 1780s. I mean, Americans like to think we had the only written constitution on the planet. It's not true at all. There are all kinds of attempts at constitutions by the end of the 18th century, not at the beginning. There are almost no functioning republics, depending on how you define one, virtually none. Theories of human inequality were everywhere to be found. Not too many theories of human equality. And although it is in the course of that 18th century that the world would experience an enormous intellectual revolution. Rooted in events, of course. We call it the Enlightenment, the Scottish Enlightenment, the French Enlightenment, the American Enlightenment, the British Enlightenment. And Enlightenment was a couple decades in some places, half a century in other places. It brought ideas to the fore that had just never had enough play or much play, although the ideas were ancient. They're in the epistles of Paul to some degree, when he's not contradicting himself. They're in the writings of many people over time, but it hadn't been forged into practice or policy or revolutions until the late 18th century. And it also became this age of revolutions, didn't it? Yale is 60, 70, and 80 years old at the time of the American, the French, and the Haitian revolutions. And those revolutions really changed this place. In fact, Yale almost didn't survive the American Revolution. The British Army came into, you'll read all about this next week, came into New Haven Harbor and basically conquered New Haven. And there was a hell of a battle fought here. But then they decided, we don't need this. And they didn't burn Yale. They didn't destroy it. They could have. Slavery and the African slave trade flourished in the 18th century. In fact, the 18th century is the great age of the African slave trade. Close to half of all the Africans brought to the Americas over 380 years came in the 18th century. That's because that's when the British took it over. Yale is founded at a moment, and it grows in its first years and decades at the time of the great boom of the British Atlantic slave trade and of the development of a huge commerce with the West Indies, a good deal of which was conducted right out of New Haven Harbor here. You'll see this in the book, but approximately 50% of all commerce in and out of New Haven Harbor, we now know, by the mid-18th century and on, went to the West Indies, went to the Sugar Islands. All about sugar production and the increase in slave labor. But also here you have the punctuation of the creation of something called the United States. There it is in the American Revolution. It's founded in the 1770s. It barely survives the war. It almost had no right to win, but it did. And I don't want to get, innocent and hagiographic about that, but what did they do out of that? They created a nation based on creeds. A creedal nation. Violated a lot of their creeds shortly after creating them. We still do. But creedal nations were a pretty new thing. That Declaration of Independence, whatever you think of it, is a remarkable document. And those 4 first principles still live, still inspire, still help people make or break other nations. But it's a creedal nation created in the world's biggest and growing slave system, the Great American Paradox. Yale College, soon university, is part of those worlds. In the 19th century, as we'll see, Yale will have an enormous expansion. It will grow in dynamism. It will grow in the very subjects that are taught in a university. It's no longer just a theology school, even by the time of the Revolution. But eventually, it's very much a place that creates its professional schools. Most of the major professional schools here were created in the early 19th century. The med school, the divinity school that was called theology school, then the law school. SOM and the environmental studies schools are 20th century creations. And I don't want to get to the 20th century here yet. I try to stay out of the 20th century whenever I can. But there was a theology at the core of this place. And more on that next week, but sometimes it's called the New Divinity of Jonathan Edwards. Sometimes it's called by other names, and it's going to get challenged and changed. It's part of the rich history of Yale is the way theology forged itself here as an educational enterprise and then just kept fighting over it and fighting over it and fighting over it and changing it. But it's a theology that came out of course, Puritanism. That believed to some degree that there was some kind of an elect. Although that, of course, changes and is richly debated. There will be Edwardians and anti-Edwardians. And Jonathan Edwards, as you'll see in the book, indeed is one of Yale's most famous slaveholders. He owned about 2 enslaved people most of his adult life, 1 male, 1 female. He sometimes used to go over to Newport, Rhode Island to buy them. But he's still Jonathan Edwards, in case anybody in Edwards College. No? Okay. He's still Jonathan Edwards. He still wrote Freedom of the Will and Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. You don't have to like him. And you might not if you read him. But now, all right, Yale is in play, and we're going to return to that in due course next week, a lot. But what about this question of how divided are we as a polity? Carl, pop up the next 3 slides if you would. I just want to say this quickly, because we'll return to it right away next week. Can we? Yeah, all right. On the server, there are now a host, you don't have to read them all, but we're going to, over the next few weeks, we're going to put up some, we've already put them up, I think, documents, just some sample documents, original stuff that we used in this book. And this was a story, by and large, hiding in plain sight in the Yale archives. I don't know exactly what percentage of all of our research came out of Beinecke, Sterling, and other Yale resources, but most of it did. It's been hiding in plain sight, some of it for 200 years, waiting to be tapped, including the story of Elihu Yale himself. Read that section. That's turned out to be quite controversial in England. In fact, one of the stiffest criticisms we've received so far, and it's good. I've been kind of disappointed nobody else has really attacked this yet. It's from an organization in England that, and at first I got really worried when I got this email. Oh my God, what do I do now? I sent it over to the president's office and say, give me some advice. And quickly we learned that it was an organization devoted to the preservation of the reputation of the British Empire. And Elihu Yale ran, the British mission, commercial mission, out of Madras in India. And they did not like the way we handled, and they say we're dead wrong, completely wrong. We're not wrong. Search from our own archives. Sometimes historians do say things are right or wrong. We don't always just say, well, there could be a little of this and a little of that, or perhaps I would suggest that maybe. No. Sometimes things are right or wrong. Okay. Now, let me plant a couple of little passages on you, and then let's dive into this question. Well, sorry. I gotta show you 2 more pictures. Sorry. This is a piece of the original map of New Haven and of where Yale College is. It's the upper corner of that map. These are all in the book. You can see these. And in the upper left corner, you've heard of the 9 squares of New Haven, perhaps? This is what constituted the Yale, whoops, I'm not supposed to move from here, sorry. The Yale campus circa 1740 to 50 or so. In the upper left corner of that map, and for today you can orient yourself, so today when you walk over that way you'll know where you are, right where the law school is. And just behind it, the corner of what is today Grove and York Street. There's a little park across the street, which we're trying to get renamed for Jethro. There was a little, see the blue rectangle? It says Jethro, black man farmer. Jethro Luke was his name. We did some deep dives into this, and I give credit here to my colleagues, Mike Moran, Hope McGrath, and others, who kept plugging on this. We know that Jethro Luke was born a slave. We don't know precisely when he was freed, but by the time this map was made, he was living there with his wife, whose name was Mindwell, and his son, whose name was Gad, and he owned that little piece of property. And when Thomas Clapp, the first president of Yale, first to hold that title in the 1740s, decided to build Connecticut Hall, the oldest building on this campus. If you've been a freshman here, you've all walked by it every bloody day. One of the greatest brick buildings in New England, National Register. It's got 222 windows on it. I don't know why I know these things, but it's a magnificent mid-18th century brick structure. Clapp built it as a classroom building and a dorm. They just kept building because they needed more buildings, and eventually it became what was known as the brick row over there. Next slide, if you could, Carl. Yeah, there it is. There it is. It's an amazing structure. It's had its bricks tucked up and tightened up and fixed up with time. I don't know how original the windows are either. The foundation is original, but that baby was built in 1748 to 1750. They had several brick kilns out here. They brought in all kinds of supplies and materials up from the harbor. And every day for a year and a half, nearly every day for a year and a half, Jethro, Luke, and his son Gad and 20 other laborers built that building. What we discovered in our research is that 5 of the men who worked on this building were slaves. If you, gosh, forgive me for walking over here, but I can't read it, so I got to walk over here. Yeah, well, these are the cost of window panes and tables and all sorts of materials. But if you could go to the next slide, yeah. If you notice on the left side, you see Mr. McNeil, his Negro wash 92 3/4 days. This is the actual handwriting, the actual records of Thomas Clapp himself, the president. He kept detailed, just like Thomas Jefferson did, detailed records of this. There is President's Negro, 83 days work. That's his own slave. He doesn't name them, although we did find out most of their names. Mr. Noyes' Negro, what is that? 7? I can't read the number there. Theophilus Mumford's Negro, 78 days, and on it goes. And I guess I just forgot to put up the slide where it says Jethro and Gad. Oh, it is there. Oh, I'm sorry. There you go. Sorry. Records their number of days down to the quarter day or half day. Now, I've always had this fantasy, and I think I even put it in a footnote in the book. Maybe it got knocked out. That some year soon at commencement, I was hoping it would be Peter Salovey's last commencement, but it didn't happen. That at some key moment, the president would announce naming something for Jethro Luke, and down the side of a Connecticut hall, a banner would drop with an imagined portrait of Jethro Luke and his son Gad, done by a Yale undergraduate from the art department. And everyone would be asked to turn around. And for 5 minutes, they'd learn that story. That hasn't happened yet. Maybe it never will. But work on it. Next slide. Okay. Leave that one up, Carl. We'll just finish with this. This was the cover of an issue of The Atlantic in 2019, just before COVID broke. Its obvious subtitle was How to Stop a Civil War. Was America on the brink of a new civil war? I have a piece in this. It's at the very end. It's about a speech by Frederick Douglass. I don't want to talk about that today, not today. My piece is sort of hopeful in this thing, which is out of character for me. Not in that speech I used in this essay, but in another place. Frederick Douglass once said, "Nations seldom listen to advice from individuals, however reasonable. They are taught less by theories than by events." Now, try that on a moment. Try that on a section if you run out of material. Are we taught by our theories? Do we respond to our, that theory we just learned in our political theory course? Maybe. Or our literary theory course, or our history course, or whatever. Or are we taught by events? What do we learn the most from? What makes us change? What makes something new happen in the world? Is it theories? Or events? Or both? How do we know the balance? Think of the events in your own lives that have just somehow changed how you think about something. or you had to, perhaps. Now, are we polarized? Yes, of course we are. How bad is it? Well, we're about to find out, I suppose. But think of it this way, and there have been 1,000 measures of this, polling of all kinds. How polarized are Americans? Well, one statistic that lots of people like to trot out is that in 1960, long time ago, less than 5% of Democrats and Republicans said they'd be unhappy if their children married someone from the other party. 5%, meaningless. In 1960, that was the Nixon-Kennedy election. Trust me. But today, approximately 35% of Republicans and 45% of Democrats would be opposed if their child married someone from the opposite party. Intermarriage used to always mean race or religion in America, ethnicity, whatever. Now it seems to be, can those families talk to each other? Maybe not, maybe. Or how wonderful that they can talk to each other for an hour and nobody killed anybody. About 2/3 of people who voted for Trump in 2016 said it was the last time, when asked, and of course this depends on how a polling question is asked, isn't it? But when asked, they said, yes, that election was the last chance to save the ultimate decline of America. Democrats get asked similar questions. Usually the word existential is in it. Is this an existential election if the other side wins? Yes. Is democracy at stake? Yes. Actually, probably is. There's a phenomenon out there now called, maybe you know about this, and maybe you're involved in this, civility culture. Organizations, groups formed or have been forming now for, 5, 6, 7 years around the country, mostly small, to try to forge civility between the red and the blue. One of them is called Better Angels, of course. It's the line from Lincoln's first inaugural, Better Angels of Our Nature. Good title. Now, at one point they had as many as 8,000 members. That's actually the size of a single precinct in LA, probably, or New York. But they try to get together, Democrats and Republicans, across the political divide, and they run workshops, all kinds of workshops. And their stated principal goal is to, quote, their motto is, let's depolarize America, start a conversation, not a fight. I'm sorry to sound a little cynical about this. They have whole seminars they run on that are called Depolarizing Within. Can you depolarize yourself? What have you done today to depolarize? I had a shower. There's a civility business now. Actually, there are other groups that go by the names, you ready? Living Room Conversations, another group. Or Bridge the Divide. That's a good name. But here's my favorite. Make America Dinner Again. You break bread together, you can talk. Now, there's a lot of reality to this, isn't there? We have a yearning. We all probably have relatives. I have cousins in Michigan who are Republicans. Trust me. They're farmers. They're brilliant. And my two cousins who are about my age run a huge farm in southern Michigan, and those guys are geniuses. They can do things that I can't. I can put on their shit-kicking boots and go out with them, but I don't have a clue what they're doing. Sorry. And we haven't talked since 2016. Yeah, it's kind of ugly. But these organizations argue that the way to solve our polarization, this is the question you might want to think about. They believe that we can solve this by simply creating more comity, more civility, more decency. Who's against that? I hate decency. Well, cynics do, kind of. In fact, the article I'm drawing most of this from is by a guy named Andrew Ferguson, and he says he goes into trauma. And whenever he sees somebody with a whiteboard and magic markers and, whatever it takes to, flip charts, he just goes into trauma and he goes the other way because somebody's about to open a workshop and make him think something that he doesn't want to think. Can you solve political division? Has the world solved? We want to believe this, don't we? Of course we want to believe this. If we could just educate the young to empathy and decency and civility and so on and so on, we'd have a better politics. Yeah. But these damned issues keep intruding. So what is this thing called democracy that seems to be at stake? We are divided because we're angry. We are divided because we have fundamentally different ideas on huge issues. But we are also and there's a lot of good analysis of this, books, essays, articles. We are divided in part because America split, slowly but surely, economically, over the last decades between urban and rural, small towns hollowing out and dying, or all but dying, manufacturing in some of those towns, or even in medium-sized cities and even larger cities, failing. Major cities growing in success and wealth because of the tech industries and a whole lot of other industries. Elites, if you like, on the coast, although there's some elites in the Midwest too. Chicago's got some elites. So does Omaha. But we've begun to really divide in ways we didn't know was even happening. Do you know the book by Tara Westover called Educated, a memoir? Came out in 2018 or 19. I met her at a book festival once. Amazing young woman. She grew up in Idaho. Sternly, strictly Christian nationalist family. Her father tried to homeschool her. She really didn't go to school for a long time. It's really quite a remarkable read. Anyway, she and I were up for the same book prizes in a couple places, and I couldn't believe she didn't win. She won a bunch of others. She got interviewed by, I think it's Jeffrey Goldberg of the Atlantic. And she makes this case that the American polarization, now she's a white Idaho, still a relatively young woman, who ended up getting herself to college and ultimately to Cambridge University, where she did a PhD in history. Woo! And now lives in New York City. And she says, still way out of place, but it's where she wants to be. She's from another world. And they don't know what she's become in her town in Idaho. But she says our, quote, economic divide now tracks almost perfectly our political divide. We sometimes forget this. Sometimes when we think, oh God, the other side just is, I can't believe they think that. Or I can't believe they do that. Or I can't believe he does that, says that. I can't believe they follow this or they do this. The right says this about the left too, and sometimes they're not all wrong. Like, why do we on the left do some of the things we do? Why do we turn on each other so much? Why do we think we have everything figured out? But we sometimes forget that people come from realities where they're not so much worried about our debates in a university. They're worried about, are there any jobs left in this town? Can I get any decent health care? What about the education of my children? They're closing another school. How do I get them into college? I can't afford college. If that's what you wake up every day, those are the things you have to think about every day, you're not going to care that much about the horrible things the demagogue is saying, but you might listen to some of the things the demagogue is saying that appeal to you. Like, your country was taken from you. It was stolen from you. And they even stole an election from me. Tara Westover has this wonderful line where she says, "The divide is deep in America. It's between the guy driving the Uber and the person in the back seat." Now that might be a fairly upscale vision. Not that Uber drivers make that much. But yeah, we're divided, badly divided. And I would put another emphasis on this, and then I want to say a few things about what democracies actually are, or we hope they are, and we hope they can become or remain. There it is. We have a constitution that is not our democracy. And sometimes we kind of equate the two. We're a democracy because we have a written constitution. No. The Constitution is not our democracy. Our democracy is not the Constitution. Our democracy has to function with that Constitution, and that's part of the problem. We do not have a fully democratic constitution. This is not news to most of you, any of you who are a lawyer. There are many undemocratic features of the U.S. Constitution. We only learn about them when our politics get so divided and so screwed up. The Electoral College. Do I have to say any more? It's the most absurd institution we have in America. Go abroad and teach. I did it two times. Try to explain the Electoral College to Europeans who have parliamentary systems, who directly elect their heads of state by popular vote. And they ask you, why don't you do it? Good question. Okay, next question. Because it's an idiotic 18th century institution that we've never found a way to change. Even our first demagogue president, arguably, Andrew Jackson, I mean, he was a powerful and important president, but he had a deep streak of demagogy in him. He advocated getting rid of the Electoral College at one point. He was a populist. He thought the frontier vote. Why do we still have it? Because it benefits one side more than the other now, and in a century from now, it might benefit, I doubt it, but it might benefit the other side. Can't change it without a constitutional amendment. But if you want to devote your lives to something that could truly change and save your country, get rid of the damned Electoral College. Please. Try to do it before I die if you can. The U.S. Senate, it is not a democratic institution. Have you noticed? It wasn't meant to be. In the 2020 election, 56.5% of all people who voted for a U.S. senator voted for a Democrat. 43.5% voted for a Republican. What's the Senate? 50-50. Kamala Harris has been the deciding vote. She cast more deciding votes than any previous vice president. A 56.5 to a 43.5 is a landslide in our system. That's a big win. But Democrats barely hung on to the Senate and probably won't this year. It's an undemocratic institution. Why does Wyoming have two? Just asking. Supreme Court. Sometimes in our history, the Supreme Court's been a fascinating and sometimes deeply admirable institution, and sometimes less so. But they're there for life. And they've always been political. Hell, in the Reconstruction era, we'll see this later, the Reconstruction era and even after, Supreme Court justices would run for president from the bench. None of them actually made it, but they would launch campaign. Yeah, it's a highly political, not supposed to be. John Roberts says they're just supposed to be umpires. Strike, ball. Really, John? All right, democracy, what is it? I'll take you out with this. We have a few minutes. It's more than selfish humanity sometimes can do. Democracy is against our instincts, usually. Now, you may be one of those rare, totally altruistic human beings. You get up every day to improve the world as fast as you can, as much as you can, with everyone around you, and you are not selfish. Bottle that up if you have it. It requires laws and structures in order to function, obviously. It requires a certain loyalty. But the loyalty has to be rewarded. And we've learned this from democracy. If you don't reward loyalty to a structure, a system, a country, who's going to hold on to it? It requires respect for humanistic and scientific knowledge. It requires universities that are free to seek the truth. And then it requires citizens to listen to them. Even when we're snooty and snarky experts. It requires a social contract. That great concept, Max Weber, many other people, that idea that between government, however you construct it, and the people, there's a deal. Governments are responsible for providing something to people, and people in return are responsible for providing something back. But that deal has to be rewarded and renewed and worked on and oiled and needs tune-ups all the time. It requires this crazy notion of obligation to your fellow person. I was going to write a book recently, I don't know, some years back. I was going to try to write a little book on the concept of humility. And there have been some good books on humility, some great philosophical works, Augustine and many others. But I quickly realized, humility's not in right now. Nobody wants to read about that. In democracy, we find the opposite of individualism. Now, what can be more American than our individualism? Tocqueville wrote so brilliantly about it, famously about it. Tocqueville spent 9 months observing these Americans, and one of the things he observed the most was their tendency toward individualism. They get caught up in that, he said, quote, the habits of their own heart. Democracy is the antithesis of the habits of your own heart. It requires you to crawl out once in a while from the habits of your own heart and think about the habits of their hearts. The absence of wherewithal for their bodies. Can democracy be enriched or destroyed by pluralism? Does democracy work best when you've got a pretty homogeneous population? Sweden? Norway? Why do the Scandinavian countries seem to have these systems that work so well? Well, we used to think it was about some kind of European race and so on, but they're becoming pretty diverse. Last thoughts. It requires, it's one of Jefferson's 4 great first principles, it requires the doctrine of consent. Popular sovereignty is consent. Governments exist because people consent to have them, and they create them, and they fuel them, they practice within them. Without consent, there is no democracy. We don't like that all the time, do we? I don't like what they're doing in that administration of that college. I don't like what they're doing in the city. Go to the city council and raise hell and say that your consent is at stake here. There's one side in this country arguing that the American dream is dead, whatever that means. Another side saying, no, it's always renewable. And it's renewable in the sheer pluralism of this crazy, wonderful place. And I'll hang the final thought on this. I know, it sounds crazy and idealistic, but it depends on education. How often do you hear this? If you're a political junkie like I am, every pundit says, well, that's the vote of the college-educated versus the non-college educated. It's a huge divider in how we count the demographics of American voting habits. Do you have a college degree or not? And that's only about 47% of the American people. Fully half of Americans do not go to college. That's easy to forget, when you walk into the Beinecke Library. Well, this place. And we'd rather be here. Liberal democracy cannot exist without liberal education. And people who fully believe in it and want to spread it and spread it and spread it and not simply own it. Okay, last thought. Sorry, I said that already, didn't I? One of my favorite thinkers of all time is Ronald Niebuhr, the great theologian, educated here at Yale. He came as a German, son of German immigrants from out in the plains. He didn't even speak good English when he arrived here in World War I, or in the eve of World War I. He learned English here to become the greatest theologian of the 20th century. In one of his books called Faith and History, Niebuhr, among other things, said this: the capacity to live in the past by memory emancipates the individual from the tyranny of the present. They can seek, quote, asylum from present tumults in a past period of history, or use the memory of a past innocency to project a future higher virtue. Go find that past back there that you really love, really like, makes you feel good. Now, go ahead. But then he says, but the processes of historical justice are not exact enough to warrant the simple confidence in a moral character to history. Moral judgments are executed in history, but never with precision. Every execution of moral judgment in history is inexact because of its necessary relation to the morally irrelevant fact of power. Your morality is always in some form doing battle with power. And power is not always moral. In fact, it might be by definition not moral. Democracy is a way we can hope to manage that collision, if we can preserve it. Okay.